All right, we'll officially begin. And I want to give a big warm welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I know more people will come in as we begin. I'm Scott Lyons from Embodied Yoga, and so grateful for all of you who are joining us and will be watching this later as well. I'm so honored and delighted to have friends and colleagues here today, Dr. Kesha Fikes, Nkem, Ndefo, Dr. Anouk Shambrook, and Dr. Ray Johnson. So grateful to have each of you. Thank you so much. Part of our mission at Embodied Yoga is to look at the technology and the processes to enhance and enliven a sense of connection. And in order to explore this process of connection, we have to look at what are the ruptures of connection. That's the subject of embodied social justice. And part of what we want to do as a constant conversation around connection and disconnection, specifically through embodied social justice, is to start these conversations. And this first conversation that we felt needed to be first was specifically on race and embodied social justice. And recognizing that the way we think, the way we act, the way we are interacted with is intrinsically bound in our body, our soma, which makes this whole process of exploring connection and disconnection an embodied process. So this conversation introduces an embodied approach to understanding the transforming patterns of relating to ourselves and others based on inequitable social power dynamics. We're going to explore the questions: how are racial dynamics embodied in the matrix of who we are? How do we explore the dynamics of a place from a place of agency, meaning a sense of choice making and sense of power? How do these explorations guide us into what we can do next in the social world? So this wisdom conversation is meant to be exactly that, a conversation. It's not going to be a formal panel where you hear me asking our panelists, our conversationalist questions, but rather they're going to be engaging with each other, asking each other questions, furthering and leading the conversations. You will hear many personal truths. Some of those may resonate with you, some of those may not, and that's okay. This is about a sharing of collective wisdom, which means that not every truth will match our own. And it is the process of that wisdom, of sharing the lived experiences of what we have come to understand, and intermixed with that of relating that with things such as science, art, psychology, anthropology, ecology, philosophy, etc., and all the other amazing backgrounds that our incredible guests are bringing to this conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our conversationalists today. I just want to also name Dr. Sarah King was not able to come last minute. She needed to attend to herself and some important things. And we're so grateful to have Anouk here as well now. So without further ado, I'd like to first introduce Dr. Kesha Fikes. Is a somatic therapist. Hi, Kesha, yeah, you can wave. Is a somatic therapist and anthropologist. She attends to the way that individual and collective traumatic experiences impact everyday lives and communities. Through attuned verbal connection, skilled touch, and slow movement, she facilitates resolution of somatic symptoms and related behavioral patterns that express unmet needs, as well as current life, intergenerational, and socio-historical unintegrated traumatic stress. Her practice is about capacity building towards relational resilience with self, one's communities, and the world. Thank you, Kesha, for joining us. Nkem Ndefo is the founder and president of Lumos Transforms and creator of the Resilience Toolkit, a model that promotes embodied self-awareness and self-regulation in an ecologically sensitive framework and social justice contexts. Licensed as a nurse midwife, Nkem also has extensive postgraduate training in complementary health modalities and emotional therapies. She brings an abundance of experience as a clinician, educator, consultant, and community strategist to innovative programs that address stress and trauma and build resilience for individuals, organizations, and communities across sectors, both in her home country, the United States, and internationally. Nkem is particularly interested in working alongside people most impacted by violence and marginalization. Nkem, thank you so much for joining us and bringing your wisdom. Dr. Anouk Shambrook, a former NASA fellow. Hi, love. Anouk has a PhD in astrophysics, rooted in wisdom teachings and more than 20 years of mind-body training. Dr. Anouk integrates the latest in neuroscience with trauma resilience, the aware ego process, and embodied non-duality in her coaching practice. In 1999, after a conversation with her Buddhist teacher about spiritual bypassing regarding race in many white US communities, he asked Anouk to start teaching. She has done several years of meditation retreats. As an associate of trauma literacy, Dr. Anouk facilitates people in making the unconscious conscious and learning body-based trauma response symptoms to promote healing and equity. Anouk, so love you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Ray Johnson is a scholar, activist, and registered somatic movement therapist who currently chairs the somatic studies specialization in depth psychology doctoral program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. The author of several books, including Elemental Movement, Knowing in Our Bones, and Embodied Social Justice. Ray teaches and trains internationally on embodied microaggression, somatic research methods, and poetic body. So if you aren't impressed by that, you will be in a few minutes by the immense wisdom that is going to be shared around this subject of race and embodied social justice. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to my friend Anouk, who's going to begin this process, this conversation by guiding us through a practice together, which will then lead us into the conversation. Anouk, I'll turn it to you.
Okay, thank you. So welcome everyone. As we engage in this kind of conversation, it's so crucial to really drop into our body in this moment. So I will make some invitations and take what resonates and leave what isn't right for you at the moment. So I invite you to close your eyes and to begin to feel your sits bones, maybe swaying your pelvis from side to side, and really feel the contact between your sits bones and whatever you're sitting on. And if you're standing or lying, then you can also work with your feet or whatever has contact with the earth. And we're going to take 3 deep breaths. As we breathe in, we're going to breathe in all that is nourishing and sustains us. And as we breathe out, we'll relax and release all that we're ready to let go of. In particular, regarding any inhibitions or strong feelings we may have around race and our comfort level around speaking about it, listening to it, thinking about it. So breathing in and breathing out. On the next inhale, I invite you to breathe all the way down into your feet. And exhale, relaxing. And on the third inhale, breathing in the sky. And relaxing, letting go, exhaling. And I'd like to invite you to think of a resource, a person, place, or thing that makes you feel more safe or more centered, more grounded. It can be your grandmother. It can be a beautiful place in nature you've gone to. It can be your favorite pet. Just whatever really helps you feel more safe and grounded. And as you recall this resource, then I invite you to notice what happens in your body. Notice what happens to your muscles. Are they tighter or more relaxed as you feel this resource in your presence? Notice your heartbeat. Is it faster or slower? Notice your muscles. And just sink into feeling supported. And if it's helpful to focus on a specific object that feels neutral or positive rather than something imagined, you can also do that. And so dropping into this moment, feeling the supportive resource, I also invite in the ancestors or any spirit guides or any energy that you feel supports your individual practice and our collective practice. And to also feel that as a resource. And now as I just share a few names, just notice what happens in your body and keep coming back to resource. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, notice the sensations and know that being present with them is the doorway to our individual and collective healing. So I invite you, before we bring this part to a close, to come back to your resource and really feel it in detail, whether it's a person, place, or thing that supports you. Breathe into that resource and feel your body in contact with the earth. And when you're ready, you can softly open your eyes, and I invite you to just allow images to come in rather than your awareness to go out, so that you stay centered in your body in this moment. And then I'd like to invite the panelists to speak when moved. Thank you, everyone.
Anouk, thank you so much for the space that this settling is supporting for us. Personally, I experienced within my own body, as well as in the atmosphere, different things with each name. And there were just combinations of fieriness, kind of a tingling around my skin, moving through my fingers, and then in thinking about George Floyd, there's a little bit of freeze and then a letting down. So really appreciating the opportunity to feel into each of these names with such nuance. Yeah. The media is responding to each of these names differently. So to actually have the opportunity to personally come into contact with what's happening within felt profound.
Thank you. I would just like to weigh in here for a moment. I actually found it extremely difficult. We recently had a lynching here in the Los Angeles area 2 days ago. And so, and doing a lot of work around embodiment with people on the front lines and doing activist work and recognizing that dropping into feel when you're in the middle of movement is actually not so useful. And so we're in the middle of, for me, I'm in the middle of direct response right now. After this, I'll be heading to a protest. I've been, his name is Robert Fuller. His name was Robert Fuller. Is being in contact with family members, being in contact with different organizers, and recognizing that I definitely have an embodied experience around this. But if I drop too fully into feeling, I stop moving. I stop moving. And that the exhortation to always drop and feel is one of privilege, frankly, because, you know, and this extends to work around, I do a lot of work with marginalized folks, working class folks, folks living with community violence, where they need to maintain some level of vigilance, right? They need to maintain some level of state of being in movement, or they'll fall apart. They'll fall apart. And so I see the work that I do is about how do I help build capacity and some spaciousness to be able to recognize the moments when it's safe enough to drop in. And so really giving ourselves compassion around the moment. Like, is this the moment to drop in, or is this the moment to move? And always, you know, I'm always a big proponent of having the lowest possible stress response in any given moment, so that you can feel as much as possible in every given moment, but know that there isn't some gold standard, that is rapidly shifting based on the context within which we are moment to moment. I just would like to throw that out. And even as that was being facilitated, I'm going to say 2 military helicopters flew overhead where I am right now. And I watched them go across. And I thought, wow, for me to really drop into feeling while I'm actively, like, you know, dealing with police, right? Like, what's the, you know, like if I completely softened, no, right? So I couldn't. And be okay that that's what I'm doing to respond to my environment appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
Well,
Ken, thank you very much. That's really helpful. Yeah.
mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Ray, if it feels appropriate, I'd love to hear your response. I wanted to add into this that I'd love this very question about when and how do we resource feels like such a potent, important doorway into this very conversation. Like, what does that even mean in a state of emergency? What does spaciousness look and feel like during a crisis like this, during a state of emergency?
Yeah, thanks, Kesha, and thank you, Nkem, for pointing out that really important distinction that I think sometimes in in my own valuing of sensing and embodiment, how important it is that I pay attention to what's needed in the moment and what feels right and what allows me to be in relationship with the demands of the moment and the demands of the environment without sacrificing myself. Yeah. And there are certainly moments when giving myself space to really feel my feelings is exactly what I need, and moments when that's exactly what I don't need. So I really appreciate you articulating that really key difference, that it's that our response to the events that we're living through needs to be responsive, not just sort of unilateral and ongoing, and there's one way to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a big place I was thinking about, you know, our topics for today and what I, you know, wanted to say, and a big thing that I've been, you know, thinking a lot about, teaching and in conversation about, is this idea around race and embodiment and trauma and healing, is about appeasement, right? Which it's often called fawning, which is just one manifestation of it. I like to use the broad term of appeasement. And just to ground, if people aren't aware what that is, I think a lot of people are aware of sort of the fight, flight, freeze. I like to think of appeasement as a combination of the two. And it exists in the context of a hierarchy of some kind. Adult, child, whatever the culture values, male identified, female identified, documented citizen, immigrant, illegal, right? White, black, light-skinned, dark-skinned, there's colorism, there's all kinds of hierarchies. But when there's that power differential and something happens something happens that's not okay from either the person or the culture or whatever it is in that structure, right? And being on the low end of that hierarchy, the impulse is to respond, to defend, right? So it's a fight, it's a flight, but it's actually not safe to express either. If I run, I will be attacked, and if I fight, I will be attacked. And so there's a freezing in place, and it's biological. We know bears do it. We know, you know, all other mammal groupings with social hierarchies, they do this, mm-hmm. right? And so I think about how that shows up in the body in a lot of different ways, and is probably, truthfully, a much more common experience than straight freeze. Straight freeze, mammals don't last very long. We don't last very long there. It's mixing with something. And truthfully, this is probably the more, but it's, you know, poorly researched and not talked about. Mm-hmm. And so I think about how the appropriateness, bringing it back, bringing that thread through about appropriateness. I think about work. I'm going to give an example. A work I was doing, these were, this was a particular young man in a group, you know, in his 20s, formerly gang affiliated, Latino in the Los Angeles area, on parole, on probation. He's on probation. And he was saying about being pulled over by police. And this is not that long ago, maybe like a year ago. And how upsetting this was for him. And we were talking about appeasement, and he was so down on himself that he would be so meek in the face of these police, right? I'm the man, why can't I say something? Why can't I do something? And when I explained appeasement as a process, as a survival mechanism, right? This wave of compassion washed over himself. And he says, because I want to get home to my babies. But the shame, right, that he felt in that collapse of, why can't I say something? But knowing, it's no guarantee. You can be super appeasing and still get killed. But you got a better chance of making it home if you appease. And so what his experience was a very lived experience for him to connect to that and understand it from like a sciencey place and make peace with what was going on. But then he said, but like, I can't keep going like this. So we talked about that you're in appeasement, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Because if you do express the fight or the flight, you're going to get it. And if you don't and you freeze in place, you get it, right? And so this idea like, well, how do you get out of it? You can't regulate yourself out of appeasement because it exists in a social hierarchy. Mm-hmm. The hierarchy has to change. So it was like, yeah, you get home to your babies, right? You get home to your babies and you have enough energy. You realize, when do I need to appease? When don't I need to appease? When can I bring it down? So you make space so we can work together for collective action for liberation, which we're seeing right now, right? So how that appropriateness, because there's so much shame in appeasement. Mm-hmm. That's enough for me. I'm preaching, I'm on it. You want a little sympathetic charge from me sometimes. You want it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things that you're speaking to, Nkem, is actually, I think, articulated in the nonverbal communication research, which is nonverbal signals of submission and subordination are demanded by members of the socially dominant group. It's required, and you will be punished if in fact you do not appease. So yeah, I think it's absolutely bound up in the social power dynamics in the hierarchy, and it's not optional.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's invisible too, because when we appease, we smile, we look sweet, we do this. And so the person being appeased thinks that person's happy. They don't know the terror. They don't know the shame. They don't know that's what's happening inside because it looks okay. And so even when you're appeasing, you start to, even like if you're like, am I overreacting? Am I seeing things like, and then you start to self-doubt and start to see yourself through the appeased eyes. And internalize, that's the internal, when we internalize that oppression, internalize racism. I'm seeing myself, I'm now appeasing. It's like it's been internalized.
I've been trying to put my finger on, and it changes every day, and where my finger goes shifts every day, around what's shifting in the collective consciousness, specifically in the last two plus weeks. And what I'm noticing is that the environment that we're swimming in right now is creating some layers of support where I'm less contracted. There's a spaciousness, a social spaciousness that I'm living that I don't know that I've ever lived before. And so just sort of practically tying in what you're describing in Kim to what we're living in this very moment, there is I don't know what the word would be, but there is a loosening of this network of supremacy that when I'm walking down the street, when I'm in the grocery store, when I'm in any kind of social space, right? I'm noticing a spaciousness which feels unfamiliar and new. This spaciousness in and of itself is allowing simultaneously for me to be connected with fire and the ground. which has felt really interesting. In having a meditation practice and in having a movement practice, I'm used to coming into contact with these things when I'm in an enclosed meditation space or when I'm by myself, which is the majority of the time when I've been engaging in these kinds of practices. But to experience this interactionally in a space feels really interesting. So yeah, this very thing, if I were to identify it, I would call it inhibition, right? Which is, we could identify as an adjective, one of the adjectives that's in opposition to appeasement. So.
Think about the kids protesting, right? I think that maybe for the first time. So as I've been doing this direct response, some of these, if you don't know, Southern California, when people think of Los Angeles, is a very image. In Los Angeles County, we have a region that is very rural and underfunded, and a lot of active white supremacy, very poor infrastructure, and poor. And this is where this lynching occurred. And so we have young people. It's very interesting. So if you look, I was this one girl I'm communicating with particularly, look at her Instagram. It's all sexy selfies, little sexy selfies, until 14 days ago when she protested for the first time. And you can see, and in talking to her, it's like she came alive. And then her friend was killed. The woman is on fire. But the disinhibition of what was held in and asleep, right? In a, you know, but I think also about how do we shepherd that? Because when we come out of suppression and oppression, we come into a lot of fight, right? And fire, like you described it, Kesha, right? You can burn down a third precinct, but you can also cook a meal. And at some point, like, how are we helping us not just burn things down, but to make that generative? Like, and those people where we work in somatics, how do we help guide that fire? So I think, you know, if anyone has any comments about that, I'm very interested to hear.
I'd just like to add, I'm uninhibited, not inhibited when I was speaking earlier, but yeah.
I got that.
Yeah.
How do we touch fire without it burning us down? How do we metabolize that anger? Right? How do we negotiate that?
Part of where I go with that question is to the question of self-regulation and co-regulation. That I think one of the hallmarks of white culture and white supremacy is this norm of independence and autonomy. And that if I've got a feeling that's overwhelming to me, I'd better take care of it. And yet I think that there are ways in which I've been socialized as a white person to not adequately, sufficiently reach out and rely on the capacity of my friends and my colleagues and my family members and my community to help me metabolize that fire, help me metabolize that rage, help me find some ground to stand on and a leverage point so that rage is channeled into constructive action and not just swallowed. So that's where I go with that. And I worry sometimes that that if we continue to channel or be in our rage, we can burn out without what I think you're talking about, which is how do we transmute it? How do we engage the alchemy of rage
Mm-hmm.
in a way that doesn't burn us out and doesn't burn other people, that isn't destructive in that particular way. And as I'm speaking, I'm also aware of the fact that in dismantling racism and a white supremacist culture, some things will need to be destroyed.
So I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit here. I just want to name that participants on the panel and participants on the call, that we come from different backgrounds, some of us from different countries, different cultures, and different races. And so I just kind of wanted to name that as we're speaking, we might be feeling different emotions coming up because of our individual history, our family history, intergenerational history. And while I just want to read a quote from Robin DiAngelo about white supremacy, and I'll preface it by saying my own experience. I've been a member of Buddhist communities for over a couple decades, and there's a lot of spiritual bypassing. I do it myself, try and catch myself. But the spiritual bypassing around white supremacy is kind of a thing in and of itself. It kind of gets conflated to help keep certain things unconscious for some of us, not all of us. And so I guess I just wanted to read this so that we don't fall into the sense of, oh, you know, those people over there are white supremacists, and I'm not a part of it if I'm white and I'm a good person. So Robin DiAngelo says, white supremacy does not refer to individual white people per se and their individual intentions, but to a political, economic, social system of domination. It is based on historical and current accumulation of structural power that privileges, centralizes, and elevates white people as a group. And I guess it partly comes up because when we're talking about co-regulating, and we're talking about these images that we have within, you know, sometimes the dominant US culture of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, as though you aren't, you know, building on the foundation of all of the riches created by slavery and displacing, you know, millions of indigenous people, then we aren't really looking at the whole context. And just the end of Robin DiAngelo's quote, I do not use white supremacy to refer to extreme hate groups. I use the term to capture the pervasiveness, magnitude, and normalcy of white dominance and assumed superiority. And so having shared that, I would just invite everyone of all races to feel what's arising in your body if it feels safe. And as Nkem suggested, to trust yourself in terms of what is safe to keep at a distance, and what is safe to engage depending on your situation in this moment. I guess I'll just add then, one of the first points that we were talking about was how racial dynamics are embedded in the matrix of who we are. So you could say that I was kind of coming full circle and speaking to how those of different race ethnicities, in a sense, experience a different matrix. Mm-hmm. And so it might lead itself to the next thing of how do we explore these dynamics from a place of choice, power, agency, which I think Nkem was already talking about when she was talking about metabolizing the fire, as well as feeling into when it is safe to engage to a certain level and when to keep the defenses up to function, so to say.
No, I mean, I think about as people are coming into their awareness journey about oppressions, structural oppressions. And, this is about, we're primarily talking about race and we're centering race, but I'm a Black woman. I'm not just a Black person or just a woman. I'm a Black woman. It's intersectional. I cannot separate those two. And that's my experience. And so as it is, if you're a white woman, right, your whiteness is one part, your woman identifiedness is the other part. And so as you're navigating these oppressions, right, so as you navigate your awareness around one, you bump up against the other ones, right? And so it's like, whoa, like pinball, like you're moving through this thing,
yeah.
Right? And
that's a great way to
think about, like who's allowed to feel anger? Again, if we come up against that appeasement thing again, right? Who's allowed to feel anger in your culture, right? So that if you're culturally not allowed to express anger, which is then it tends to keep you into that appease. So when you come out of it, not only when you come out of an appeasement or a freeze type state, an oppressed state, and you come into anger and that movement, that fire, then you're culturally shamed. So as a Black woman, we step into that, we're an angry Black woman. Okay? So if I say anything, I'm an angry Black woman. And I say I was, in leadership in a somatically based trauma healing system where I was told that I should not talk like that. And I should behave more because I was stepping into power and how that, right? Like what's right. And so being aware, as you navigate it, that you can't examine one without the other. Even if you're centering your race work, and you're like, how is this impacting? Where's the gender in the intersection?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
No, as we're all speaking, I'm noticing an interesting tension within myself that has to do with time space. And I'm noticing that when I go to respond in this format or in any of the other formats that I've been in, it's like the first thing that comes to mind thought-wise is how I would have held these questions, two months ago, which would have been in a different place. And within I want to say 10 seconds, it's almost, my brain kind of catches up. And I'm like, but I'm in a different space right now. And so the way in which I framed race, the way in which I made sense of race in this moment is tied to a different historical context, which is the immediate moment where I'm personally experiencing the spaciousness. So I'm just noticing as I talk about this, that my brain is doing all this really interesting work because I've been writing about race for 20 plus years. So I have this narrative history. And in my past life, I was a theoretician of race. So I've got all of this information in the back, which would generally be funneled through me when I would talk about race, right? And now I'm in this space where my lived experience of this idea is very different. And so I'm noticing that a new way of communicating, like a new narrative, a new something is wanting to come through, which is in response to the spaciousness that's been created in this moment. So there's this really interesting thing that's happening where my brain is working to catch up with how to define what's shifting. And then there's another part of me that I'm connecting with, which is aware that we are, if we were to talk about a curve, we are on the rapidly spiraling upward movement. And at some point, the curve is going to flatten. The momentum that we're experiencing right now is going to flatten, as historically things do, right? And so I'm noticing that I'm also holding that time space. And so I'm just noticing that there's, and I'm loving it. Like, it feels incredibly generative to have to contend and be in relationship with time in such a radical way, in being in this moment. And it's moving me to, it's new terms, new ways of framing, new ways of thinking. It's exhausting, it's painful, it's enraging, and it's generative. So, I just wanted to name this sort of mind game that's occurring in my mind as I'm speaking, that's tied to this changing moment. Every second of every moment of the day is changing, right? But we're experiencing the unusualness of this moment. And I'm just really, noticing how it's impacting my capacity to conceptualize.
Wow.
I feel like it's a spaciousness, but there's also pressure because there's the urgency of the moment.
Yes.
Right? There's the urgency of the moment. And I've been saying to people, particularly this week, it's urgent that we start. It's not urgent that we finish, because we still need to be strategic, but let's start. I do work like community level and organizational level work and some policy work, which is a little different. It's like how you bring embodiment around these issues at that level, right? So a certain city, the city transportation department was interested in a race process, a race equity process from an embodied place. I was like, whoa, and it's a good sized city. It's a good sized department, but transportation of all, maybe like 1,500 people. So what is that like, right? How do you navigate that in a governmental, like typical bureaucracy, and bringing this idea? So they're suddenly, okay, talk about spaciousness, and like they're willing to talk about things that I would like, because I always am like, the body will hijack you, you got to bring it along. But that there's space around it, but then there's also this urgency, right? This urgency to act now, and being careful that the urgency doesn't constrain the vision. That the urgency will constrain our vision about what is possible, because we are so conditioned. It is the water we swim in. It's hard to even, I mean, we don't know what we don't know. What is the Dick Cheney, the unknown unknowns? And that they're being revealed to us over and over again. Oh yeah, that construct. And they're so deeply wound into us, and the willingness to also be okay to make mistakes. Like, you need spaciousness to make mistakes in a process, right?
That's right.
and guarantee we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
As we try to navigate our way through these biological responses and socially constructed, system.
Yeah.
And to envision new things. So Kesha, I appreciate the acknowledgement of the process that we're going through simultaneously, in the dismantling, in the visioning, in the building, in the strategizing, in the pushing, in the resting.
And
Yeah.
what you're saying is also, I'm now thinking about two different kinds of urgency that I think many of us are experiencing simultaneously. There's the urgency of being in a state of emergency, of being under siege during this moment, right? The safety issue, right? The real sort of life being threatened. There's that urgency, and then there's also what's coming to mind. There's also the urgency of wanting to respond to this moment, right? And so there are these, and I'm sure there are other forms of urgency, but it seems like we're contending with two different, at least at a minimum, two different somatic experiences of urgency, right? One tied to actually one's life being under threat, and the other being a ferocious desire to take advantage of this moment, right? A real need to get it right in this moment. Like it has to, you know what I mean? Which this is an inherently messy process. But yeah, the pressure of, what's materially real as well as what's psychically real.
I mean, COVID, it's like the setup for COVID before this, right? So the setup for COVID, so many things were in disarray, so many structures and processes were in disarray. There was already all these openings. Like the message I kept getting was look for the openings and helping people make space. I mean, that's my goal in life. Is help people make space for healing and transformation, right? I do like sort of preparatory work, right? And that's what the resilience toolkit's like, that preparatory work. And I said, keep looking for the openings. And never did I think that this opening would come. And so we recognize it for what it is. This is a historic moment of opening for so many of us to move through. But, we just need to get on the bridge. The bridge is long. We need to get on the bridge and stay on the bridge. And what does it mean to stay on the bridge as we do this together with so much hurt? There's so much hurt and wounding. I think about an attachment, right? In attachment, when, you come back from, as Scott was talking about, you're coming back into the repair after a rupture. There's a lot of hurt feelings that need to be acknowledged, right? And how do we acknowledge those? In acknowledging the power dynamics, socially constructed, biologically expressed, to stay on the bridge together, stay on the bridge together. And but what's also exciting about this moment? It was another place of opening here, is the collaboration. It's like the collective wisdom that happens when people are working together, that can't happen alone. So speaks to Ray, what you were talking about in that co-regulation, like the magic between is greater. It's an alchemy. It's greater than the sum of the ingredients. And so that as we work together with all of our wounding, with all of, like, there's a magic that we can make only in this moment, right? What is the saying? Find the conversation we can have together in this moment only. So that also is a spaciousness, which to me creates like, that kind of sparky, adrenaline, like, ooh, let's go, juicy, let's do it kind of feeling.
I know, you're contagious right now.
Girl, I'm about to go to a protest. That's what you seeing. I've held myself, I have a chronic illness, so I've held myself back this entire time. My kids are like, Mom, I know you really want to be out there. You really want to be out there. And I'm holding, and I just, after this, I'm like, I'm going. This is it. So it feels, you know, like, so what are the other constraints? That's a body constraint that I'm working with of a chronic illness, right? And thankfully I've been, you know, in treatment and finally after a decade getting better, right? So navigating what that excitement is. Mm-hmm.
One thing that I've been doing in connection to this in Nkem is kind of journaling about what kind of engaged activist am I? Like when we're out on the street, where am I generally positioned? Right? Like where am I want to be able to like navigate different spaces when I'm out on the street, but it's sort of like where do I tend to go, right? And how much of that is tied into fear and how much of that is tied into what I actually add or contribute when I'm supporting, right? So I'm the person who shows up to the protest with food in case people don't go home, right? Yeah, like, you know what I mean? Like that's when I've historically been on the front line, right? I'm up the night before cooking or I'm doing whatever and I bring trays of food for the people that aren't gonna leave the front line, right? So I've been kind of playing around with what's that role about, right? Do I wanna change it? Is that actually my role? Right? Do I want to further ground in that? Right? Just kind of thinking about who am I on the front line? Yeah. And as I think about it, it's one of the ways in which I stay engaged sustainably. Right?
There's your fire. You're cooking with that fire.
Right.
There
Right.
I think about if we think about the United States civil rights movement, Black civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and there's, who was cooking? There was armies of church women cooking for those protesters. That the sandwich lines were insane, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what does fire, there's a lot of questions there about metabolism of fire.
Right.
Right? About where does it go? Where is it generative? Right?
Right.
And what's culturally acceptable? It's a culturally acceptable place for a woman-identified person to put our fire towards nurturance.
Right. That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And that really might be our jam. Quadruple cancer over here. I'm gonna cook for you. Oh. Mm-hmm. So is it art making, right? Like the other place? Go ahead, Ray. Yeah.
Just it feels to me that the part of what we're talking about is where's our leverage,
right?
And that if we think about what contribution we're making in dismantling racism, where are my assets? Where are my skills? Where are my capacities? And where can I find a leverage point to do the most effective work? And that's what I was sitting with when you were talking, Kesha, was finding that place so that when I put my back into it, when I put the force of my commitment on that leverage point, something happens. And there are both, I think for me, places where I feel comfortable, places where I feel uncomfortable, but maybe should go to. And so it's been my own exploration of not just where can I do the most good in a way that feels like it's in integrity with me, but also what's needed. And how can I stretch myself to develop some leverage in places where I'm needed, not just where I'm comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the other thing is in our conversation about rage and metabolizing rage and working with it and harnessing it. One of, I think, my big tasks as a white-bodied person is to learn how and to develop the capacity to be with Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, and their rage without freaking out. To just build some space for that, and that feels necessary. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That makes me smile on the inside, Ray. That makes me smile on the inside. I think it's like, I hear a lot of white folks like, what can I do? And there's some capacity building, right? Like some real basic capacity building to not collapse at the discomfort. And it's not to say it's not about pushing yourself so that you re-traumatize yourself. That's not useful to anybody, but where's your window of tolerance and can you grow, right? You go to the gym and you work out or we used to before COVID, but you're working out something like you're using your muscles and it's uncomfortable, right? For muscles to grow, there's some discomfort as you go. And how to recognize what, like teacher, they say like in education, like when you're teaching a kid to read or a kid's reading, that if you read a book, a kid's reading a book, or even us as grownups, is if you have to look up 5 words on the page, it's it's too much. It's too much for you because you have to like look up that one and it's too many new concepts and you get lost. So that there's a zone, maybe it's 3 new words on the page, but you can stay in the game. Right? And maybe uncomfortable because you're looking stuff up, but you can stay in the game. And it's being able to recognize, wait a second, where can I build my capacity to stay in this conversation? Right? And that even as a Black woman, for me to go against my conditioning and allow my anger to be expressed. Ooh, right? So that's an edge for me. Like, I can say something here. I can say something, right? So there's growth happening on all sides as we're recalibrating this. And just being aware of where a willingness to push into the discomfort, but being aware if we push too far, we're going to shut down. So how do we navigate this? And so this takes steady work. It's trauma healing.
And resilience building. Right? To step outside our window of tolerance just enough to build some muscle.
Right.
Just so that the window doesn't stay at the same place that it's always been. That I actually commit to building some somatic emotional bandwidth for the pain of other people. Yeah. Not just for my own pain. Right? Not just in my own sort of trauma healing. But I think that's a really important part of the work.
This feels like an ideal space to one of the conversations that we had offline was about making a distinction between what is social justice and what is embodied social justice. And I feel like what we're describing right now, what we're sharing right now, is what distinguishes embodied social justice from just social justice, right? And it also loops us back into not bypassing race in practices of embodiment, right? That embodied social justice is about coming into awareness of some particular resources that we can use to sustainably maintain a social justice agenda, but it is not reducible to being socially active, right? Like being embodied is not the definition of social justice, right? It's a resource. It's a capacity building resource that sustains our engagement in social justice, right? And in that sense, embodiment is not reducible to anti-racism, right? It's a vessel through which we come into contact with the practice of anti-racism, right? But it is not reducible to anti-racism, which feels important to name.
Preach. That was so good.
Yeah.
Right? Because I see, you know, folks are like, well, it's like all about the it's the binary, right? It's the binary. It's either I'm doing the social justice work or I'm doing the embodiment and the trauma healing work. And they're inseparable, just like your body and your mind are inseparable. It's really well said. Thank you, Kesha. I had to write that one down. That was good. It's really any change process, right? Any change process, you need some spaciousness, right? And spaciousness, we can't make spaciousness in our head. It's a body process is where we make it. Where do we make safety? Safety gives space, trust gives space. Those are all, you know, bottom up. It's just, what do we do with it?
Right.
Once you've made the space, like I always say, like, we don't make capacity so you can sit on the couch and eat bonbons. I mean, you can if you want, right? And it's nice. They better taste good, some chocolate, right? But what are you going to do with that extra space and that extra bandwidth? Right? We call it alchemical resilience. That's our term. And this idea that it's a resilience, not just for bouncing back or bouncing forward, but it's to have the spaciousness to transform the conditions of adversity in the first place. So we don't need to be so resilient. So we can rest and have more joy.
Wow. Wow. Transforming the system that is impacting us.
But
that the environment influences. Yeah.
But you'd be hard pressed to do that without bringing your body along. It's just, I'm like still tripping that a city department of transportation wants to do embodiment work around race. I'm like, we in a new era. We in a new era. It's not like, you know, it's a very white city. It's very interesting. Can we take some questions from folks, Scott?
I was just going to ask if this is an okay time. I didn't want to interrupt. Okay. So yeah, if you head down to the chat on the bottom ribbon, and this will be a great time for us to have questions. I know you have spoken to this, but I did notice that a few of the questions were directed about essentially how do we work with anger? Like, what are the tangible practices? And we could say it perhaps the same with the resilience of like, how do we extend the resilience? How do we expand to be able to hold that in ourselves? And then perhaps, as Ray was speaking to, like, hold the space so that someone else can also hold that. If that feels like a good question to begin with. There's a few more and I'll keep writing them down.
I'll just add a piece. Just a piece that I work with that's been helpful personally is to remember that the physiological purpose of anger is to mobilize us into action, right? that it specifically has that purpose to move us into action. It's a mobilizer, right? Physiologically, mentally, in every possible way. So I'll just add that. I know all of us working somatically, we probably have a lot to say about how to hold anger. But for me personally, remembering that piece is really helpful, because if we experience it as something that we're supposed to inhibit, right? But to staying connected to what its actual physiological function is.
Yeah. And often when we're feeling it at times when it feels like our boundary has been crossed. And it's our internal override of the other part of us that is more likely to appease, or another part of us that, wants to keep relationships, not endanger them, that kind of thing. And so if we take it like as a cue, an internal cue, regardless of how we then work with the energy, whether or not we act on the energy, then it's a gift in that sense.
I mean, I think the question about capacity building, I actually thought about this quite intentionally, that most people really, truthfully, if you say the word trauma, they just shut down, or that's somebody else. It's not a useful word in the general public. You all may be able to have the bandwidth for it, but it's not so useful in the general public at all. And so I thought, why? Because if we know that trauma is the rupture that's like really causative of most of our suffering, why isn't it that people can even get in that conversation, even identify it? It's not resistance, it's not denial, it's lack of capacity, is how I conceive of it. And so what do you do to build that? And so the way that I've approached it is through helping people become aware of their stress, I use the word stress, but it covers more than stress, hint, but their stress levels, and then asking themselves, and really, how do I know? So they really start to develop an interoception, of the capacity to feel within themselves, and then define for themselves, is this serving me or not serving me? And if it's not, and most people recognizing that they're in an over-responding state, is how to practice tools to bring their stress level down. And when you do, right, when we come down, there's more openness, right? When our stress levels are less, there is more safety, there is more openness. And that's how you create it over and over and over again. And teaching people how to evaluate if something's working for them or not working for them in that way. And so that's the direct capacity building work that I do. And that when people have that space, right, then there's actually natural curiosity that comes. There's openness to trying new and different ways of happening, right? And there's a generative energy that is a little different than the protective. It's a lot different than the protective, defending energy of anger, or the shutdown energy of protection. It's an energy of curious exploration and connection, and wanting to be in collaboration. And I find that's where the magic happens. You don't have to direct it that much. You ask any child and they're like, ooh, what's that? And a little child who's still in the magic, that we have that when we can get people back to that space, and you put them together, then, and they know how to get themselves back to that space when they get knocked out of it. That's the collective wisdom stuff that can kind of happen.
Thank you so much. Is that okay to bring in the next question?
Could I just say one thing about anger?
Yes, please.
One of the most important things that I learned as I was beginning to cultivate some capacity around embodying my emotional life was a teacher who said to me, don't conflate anger with violence. And that might be useful to say in these times, that 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 feeling anger doesn't mean that the way in which I am going to act on that anger is going to result in violence or harm to another person. It's just an emotion. And it's not inherently damaging or destructive. I can choose, once I am able to embody it and feel it and manage it, I can choose how and where to direct it. And that's part of my responsibility. So I wanted to just add that. Thanks, Scott, for that extra little half a second.
Thank each of you for just talking about the process of essentially uncoupling anger with something that it's not, and naming it as this fire, this genesis of response and change. There was a question about how do we build space, and then once space is present, what comes next, which I think is a great question.
I'm going to say same answer. Same answer. Sorry. Maybe I was ahead of the anger on that one. So just like put my answer from last time and move it over here. Okay.
Done. Would anyone else like to speak to that particular question? Wait, if not, there are other questions.
I think that it's been said, but I'll just highlight that when I feel a sense of safety, when I feel seen or heard by myself or by another person who is safe and I trust, then in that sense of safety, literally it's like a space opens up. And for me, there's a space literally in my body. There's a space in my psyche. And I also, have heard Kesha and others speaking to a space that is emerging collectively. And I kind of feel like the contrast of space is when we're entangled. And especially if, we're in a stress response mode, fight, flight, freeze, appease, then we aren't actually open to the magic. And so I just feel like the creating of safety and finding different methods to do that I think yoga can be a method of going through the body. I think there are lots of methods. Then once we have that space, I think that's if we've been doing our internal work, even, like when Ray was talking about developing the somatic emotional bandwidth, then we can have the capacity to deal with what's arising rather than have the space and then something, potentially charged comes in and then we immediately shut it down again. And so the more that we can do that, then also the new vision that Kesha was describing of what's emerging, and can I let go a little bit of the stories I had and be present to what is emerging collectively, then I think those are some potential explorations of the space.
There was an interesting question that came out of this process of resilience building and building more capacity, which is referencing the influx in the constant flow of images. And I think it's a really interesting question about the influx of images, videos, and how does that relate or hinder or enhance the growing of capacity and resilience for what is present.
I'll just say a small thing, but I feel a really important just practical thing to do is to care for yourself. And when you take in those images, you know, for me personally, then after a certain hour in the evening, I don't take it in, because then it goes into my sleep and I'm using it, you know, my sleep to metabolize it rather than to actually rejuvenate. So I'll just kind of add that as a practical piece, that sometimes you can really titrate how much, how often, when alone with others, that you take it in.
I mean, this is a hard one. I mean, let's go back to the image of Emmett Till. His mother, so those not from the United States, I want to honor, you might not know the story of Emmett Till, who was a young teen, I think 13 or so, who was from the Chicago area and was down in the South. And this is, I guess, the early 60s, mid 60s. I'm sorry if I don't know the exact year, but he, actually, he had I think this is interesting from an embodied perspective. If you didn't know, he had polio. He was a polio survivor. And it affected his speech and in his breathing, right? His breathing. And so his mother had taught him how to whistle to get air through. And so he probably whistled. And a white woman said, "He whistled at me." And so he was lynched, brutally so. And his mother insisted on an open casket. She insisted on an open casket so that the world could see what happened to her baby. And it was brutal, but it was catalyzing.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a fine line, right? Like, I have not watched the George Floyd video. I cannot watch it. I cannot look at it because I know it will break me. So, but sometimes we don't have a choice. It just pops up in our feed, right? Or should we share it or not share it, right? So there's this line of how do we walk? I think you're right, Scott. It's a very interesting question because there is a need for, for things to be catalyzed, and there is a need for truth telling. And we also need to be conscious about not re-traumatizing people excessively. And I don't know what that line is, and it probably shifts from moment to moment. One thing I notice is I do not consume news. I try to consume news where I can engage. I can choose how it's not like a flow. Like, as much in the US as I love Amy Goodman and Democracy Now!, I have a hard time listening because I don't know what's coming next. As opposed to I can engage the flow. And I think she's one of the most important voices we have here. So that's one way that I've been able to navigate it, but I do share stuff. I try to find, sometimes it's in writing instead of an image, but sometimes we need the images too. So I'm figuring it out imperfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Kesha, Ray, would you like to add to that around the process of navigating the influx of images and capacity building and overwhelm?
Ditto what's been said.
Yeah.
But I have also been exploring just letting it come in. Just observing, just letting it come in. Yeah. And how I respond to that.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge a few questions that came in specific around a certain subject, and say there was questions around guilt and shame. And I just want to name that we won't be covering that in this particular time. But it is a conversation to be had, and one that's actually in the works of being talked about in a couple weeks. So thank you for those questions. I do want to acknowledge that. And I want to then redirect it back to this particular panel. Perhaps we could land with this question from Duda of what are some daily practices of embodied social justice? And I think we can add to that, if it feels right, daily practices around race and embodied social justice.
I want to highly recommend Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hand. In terms of, like, in the English language, I find he really takes this important somatic body-based work and applies it to race. And it speaks both to white people, people of color, and the police. It feels very relevant, and he has a lot of practices, very, like he says, don't keep reading unless you're doing the somatic practice right now. So yeah, definitely I find, I mean, for me, meditation and body-based work, dance, movement, I mean, especially like if I'm facilitating a group, facilitating movement so that people can allow things to move through, that they might be, you know, like it might, they might not feel that they have other safe spaces to allow a little of that movement. And then humility, maybe that doesn't sound like a formal practice, curiosity, you know, discovering what helps you to feel more capacity, even just the basics of sleeping and getting enough food. It really impacts my capacity when another, you know, thing and you find out at a protest this happened, or so I'll pass it over to others. But yeah, luckily that's something that it's a rich field, and it's beautiful that we can each find what works for us. And so I would just say to really be curious and observe what helps you. Like to try on things people suggest, but ultimately you end up being your own best expert. And that's a beautiful thing.
I tremor every day. I use a therapeutic tremor, short, 90 seconds or so. These days, normally it's like once a day, maybe twice a day. These days, sometimes it's every hour. And that's what helps me just rapidly, just again, keep myself in an effective stress response for the moment, whether I need to be focused and using that really driven energy, or I'm really visioning, collaborating, resting, effective rest. Finding spots of joy to stay. Again, it's part of it. It's like, I think the biggest piece here is being able to stay in the in the conversation. There's a certain amount of education you need around the language and around some of the framing. And the other part is having to build your capacity to get in the conversation, stay in the conversation, and have conversations with yourself and others. Experience rupture, make repair.
Tolerate discomfort, build capacity for discomfort. I've added to that to get uncomfortable when I'm comfortable, like to be suspicious of being comfortable as a white body person. The other thing that I do is I begin to get curious about my body language, how I embody, how I unconsciously communicate racist power dynamics through my own body language, through my postures and my gestures and the way I use touch and eye contact, and how much space I take up as a white person, how much I talk, just to really notice that as a practice, as an awareness practice of what am I doing and what effect is that having, and really paying attention to the relational nonverbal power dynamics that inform my interactions with other people.
Beautiful. And I would add to that, a huge resource for me has been staying connected with people, right? And there are different ways in which I can do that. One way, if other folks aren't available, is feeling into the collective field when I meditate. Like actually feeling into the energy of the momentum in the atmosphere. That's been, there's an excitement and an openness in that when I connect with that. And just, I've been picking up the phone a lot and just calling people who I know are also engaged in what's happening in different capacities, in different ways, like really staying connected. Because, you know, some things that happen have been so kind of surreal in a magnificent kind of way that it's almost like I need a witness. Did you see that? Did that just happen? Okay. Yes, that happened. So much is happening so quickly. That just having, you know, our peeps as reference points. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So as we start to find a pause or a landing in this conversation, which will hopefully be just a pause so that we can actually continue this in the many formats it might take, I just want to first thank the conversationalists. I don't have a great name yet. Panelist always feels like such a, I like conversationalist, wisdom conversationalist. I don't know. We'll figure it out together. But I'd like to thank each of you so much. I just want to recognize, just even from the comments, that your sharings have validated people's experiences, have helped them feel connected and seen and met, and hopefully a little uncomfortable with the recognition and the normalization that is important and okay.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank you, Anouk. Thank you so much. Kesha, thank you so much. Nkem, thank you so much. Ray, thank you so much. Thank you all for your wisdom. Thank you all for those who have came to this conversation, this wisdom conversation, and thank you for those who will be watching it. When we send you the link, please feel free to share it. It's an important conversation that and wisdom that is, I hope, continues to validate, normalize, and make people uncomfortable. I know it did for me. So thank you all so much. And hopefully this will just be the beginning of this connection. So please be safe, take care of yourselves and others, and we'll be in touch soon. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Oh, and we put the links and we'll in the follow-up email of each of these panelists, conversationalists, still figuring out the word. Please follow them on their websites, on their mailing list, on their Instagram. Help let people know about this incredible wealth of wisdom of these individuals. So thank you all so much. Take care.